So welcome everybody to the first webinar of the Manitoba Important Bird Areas Spring Webinar Series this year. My name is Amanda and I am the coordinator of the Manitoba IBA program. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are joining this webinar from across the province of Manitoba on the territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, and Ojibwe nations and the homeland of the Métis Nation. The Nature Manitoba office sits in Treaty 1 territory and the ancestral and traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. All of these people have been caretakers of the land since time immemorial and continue to be strong caretakers of the land today and into the future. And we are here today to talk about the bird collections at the Manitoba Museum with zoology curator, Dr. Randy Mooi. Randy received his PhD in zoology from the University of Toronto, working on the evolutionary history of coral reef fishes. He then completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Smithsonian Institution investigating the biology of deep sea fish families and examining the relationship of perch-like fishes. Dr. Mooi joined the Manitoba Museum in 2004, focusing on fish evolution and post-glacial biogeography of snakes, toads, and sticklebacks in the province. Moving on to birds, Randy was also a regional coordinator of the Manitoba Breeding Bird Atlas, as well as part of the steering committee and technical committees for the Atlas. As well, he has joined the IBA program on many bird blitzes, and we are very happy to hear from him today. So Randy, you can go ahead.
Okay, thanks very much, Amanda. Thanks for inviting me to your webinar series. It's quite an honor. So today, what I'm planning on doing is giving you a behind-the-scenes virtual tour of the bird collections at the Manitoba Museum, and we'll answer a few questions along the way, like why have a collection? Why do we have so many birds? Where do they come from? What connection do they have with important bird areas? And how do collections help conservation efforts? So when you come to the museum, and I certainly hope you come to the museum often, you usually enter through the Rupert Street entrance, which is on the north side, and you go into the lobby and you turn left. And when you turn left, you head towards the galleries. And inside the galleries, you certainly will find bird specimens. This is one of our newer galleries, the Prairies Gallery, just opened about a year ago. And the thing is that we only have less than 2% of the actual bird collection on display at any time in the galleries themselves. So instead of going to the left into the galleries when we enter the museum, I'm going to take you to the right and go into the elevator and key you up to the natural history floor on the 4th floor, which has restricted access because that's where we have our collection facilities. So across from my office is the Natural History Collection Storage. This is a 2,600 square foot space. You can see here the compactor units. We can turn these cranks here and move these back and forth, and this gives us a lot more space. We only have to have one aisle open that way. And this area actually is kept at a constant temperature, about 65 degrees or so, 50% humidity, to try to keep, this is a data logger, to try to keep the collection in the right sort of environment. There's many different kinds of collections in the natural history space. So we have wet collections. This is the traditional way that we store frogs and snakes and fishes. We have about 15,000 specimens of those. We have about 24,000 specimens of mammals, including mammal skins of various species, skeletons like this cougar skull here, about 50,000 plant specimens. Most of these are herbarium, classic herbarium specimens on sheets. And we also have invertebrates, about 65,000 insects, and then another 10 to 15,000 other invertebrates, things like mollusks and arachnids, spiders and things. And of course, we have the geology paleontology collection, And that includes rocks and minerals and fossils, and there's about 15,000 specimens of those. But of course, we aren't here to talk about these other collections today. We're here to talk about the bird collection. And here's a great blue heron peeking in between the wet collection here that's waiting to be cataloged and put into the bird collection. And here, the bird collection has a few different sorts of specimens. These are mounts. So these are taxidermied specimens. We have about 700 of these. These are mounted in more or less lifelike poses, depending on the quality of the taxidermist. And we have quite a diversity. You can see some small birds here, a couple of species of shrikes and other species. Some up on the top right there, we have some shorebirds, along with some gulls, and even larger birds like bald eagles and golden eagles on the bottom here. So you can see they take up quite a lot of space. So there are better ways to have collections. These are really excellent, though, for educational purposes. And of course, they're very helpful for us to put together exhibits. We have about 230 skeletons as well. On the top here is a tundra swan skeleton. This is a golden eagle skeleton. And then the skulls of a golden eagle on top and a bald eagle on the bottom for comparison. You can see the larger bill of the bald eagle compared to the golden eagle on top. And these collections are really excellent comparative materials. We can, when people bring in just separate bones, we can use these collections to compare them and see what species they bring in. They're also incredibly important for archaeology because as they're digging up old campsites, Hudson Bay Company posts, those sorts of things, and they find bird bones, they can find out what those people were hunting and probably eating at that time. We have a small egg collection, relatively small egg collection as well, with about 600 clutches of eggs. These were collected quite a long time ago. This, of course, is not legal to do any longer. And these were large collections from just a couple of collectors for the most part, who donated their collections later on. We also have a few nests, just a few dozen, and here is one of them. Just an example here. This is a strange little nest of a song sparrow in Churchill that was actually built inside a tin can. Here's a typical clutch of eggs. This is a whimbrel from Churchill, collected in 1950. By far the largest part of our collection, though, are the study skins. We have about 6,000 or so study skins, and this is an incredibly important library of birds. So each one of these birds is collected at a particular time and a particular place and gives a bit of a snapshot of what's happening in the bird world and in the environment in mostly Manitoba at a particular time. So you might wonder why we still have collections when, there's lots and lots of birders out there now, people taking photographs, they're entering their data on eBird, they're doing backyard bird counts at their feeders and things like that. So there's lots of data around. So why do we need collections still? And that's sort of what I'm going to be talking about a little bit for at least part of the talk. And you might wonder why we have so many. 6,000 birds sounds like a lot. And just to put that in perspective, though, our collections actually span all the way back to about 1880. So that's 6,000 specimens of birds that have been collected over 140 years. And when you consider that maybe as many, somewhere between 15 and 30 million birds are killed hitting windows in Canada every year, and there's been estimated as many as 3 billion birds are caught by cats over the year in North America, it's really not that large a number of birds. It still is a lot of birds. 6,000 birds is a lot. I'm not trying to minimize that, but it is a good sampling, and yet not a ridiculous amount of sampling for our birds. And we do have a lot of them because we all know that birds come in different plumages. So in the spring, they have summer plumages, and winter plumages. There's males and females, there's juveniles, there's sort of oddball colors sometimes, like these. These were collected near Whitewater Lake in the 1920s. This is a stilt sandpiper, regular coloration on the right, and on the left is this weirdo with this white sort of collar all the way around it. So we have a way of documenting some of these different colorations. There's geographic variation. So when you collect birds in different places, they have different colors and sometimes even different behaviors. And that could be recorded in the collection. We do have some exotics as well. We have a lot of partnerships. One of our partnerships is with the zoo. And so sometimes we get some of their birds from when they die of various causes, either old age or for whatever reason. So we add a few of those to the collection just for educational purposes. One of the weirdest groups of specimens we have are these king penguin bits that were traded long before I arrived at the museum with a museum in Argentina. This clutch of eggs here is in a way exotic. It's from New Orleans. These are clapper rail eggs. And this clutch I put in here because this is the oldest, these are the oldest specimens we have in the collection. They date back to 1880. And that really is the value of the collections. A good comprehensive museum collection acts like a time machine. So we can go back in time, like for instance, using these 1880 eggs, or this is the earliest study skin we have, a whooping crane from Sanford, Manitoba in 1891, allows us to go back through the decades and see what was happening in the environment and what was happening to our birds over a very long period of time. Just as an example, here's some research that was done on some museum specimens. This is an ivory gull that is from the Manitoba Museum collection, collected in 1926, just north of the Paw. And this group of researchers gathered feathers from museum specimens. I actually removed the feathers and sent them to these researchers, as did many other museums. And they were able to look at the level of methylmercury in ivory gulls over a 130-year period. And what they found was that indeed methylmercury levels in this endangered gull were rising over that 130-year time span. They also looked at the feathers and took stable isotopes out of them to find out that they were actually still feeding on all the same sorts of foods today as they were 130 years ago. So it's very likely that the higher methylmercury levels in these birds is due to higher levels in the environment. Methylmercury causes all sorts of problems for reproduction and behavior. And so this might help explain one of the reasons that populations of ivory gulls is decreasing. Museum specimens are critical in finding those sorts of things out with this sort of time machine application. So where did these specimens come from? Well, most of our specimens, or a good number of them anyway, were inherited from an earlier version of the Manitoba Museum that started in 1932 in the Civic Auditorium. Today, the Civic Auditorium is the Manitoba Archives building on Vaughan, just across from the Winnipeg Art Gallery. And that Manitoba Museum had a very humble beginning. It was in this red square here, just essentially one room in this giant building. It was only about 1,700 square feet. So here it is, empty, in 1932, just before they started filling it with collections. And certainly they did that through some of their own collecting efforts and then donations from the public and various other institutions. And that included birds. Some of the people that started the first Manitoba Museum were very prominent in the Manitoba birding community. People like A.G. Lawrence, Bert Cartwright, and several others. And so they definitely focused on birds and put together quite a fine collection. And we still have many of these today. In this red circle is actually 3 passenger pigeons that we still have in the collection. This is one of them on the left here, along with a mourning dove for comparison, in about 1936. So this is what their exhibit looked like. Today, we're still exhibiting this specimen. This is the same passenger pigeon specimen in the brand new Prairies Gallery. So you can come down and see this specimen. It's the last specimen that was ever collected in Canada in 1898. And then we've put together a little more complex exhibit about it than in 1936, talking about market hunting and then looking at its biology in Manitoba. Taxidermists are another source of many of our older collections. You saw the mounts that we had. Most of those are older mounts from early taxidermists. Taxidermy was a very popular thing in Manitoba through, till about 1950 or so. But in the early 1900s, there were dozens of taxidermists in Winnipeg, for instance. And these acted like small museums before we actually had a museum here. So people could go into these, see birds and mammals that they couldn't see otherwise. And they also purchased these and brought them home. And eventually, they either got tired of them, they were in the family for so long, they were found in the attic, people call us up and then they donate them to us. So we have a lot of these specimens in our collection. This particular taxidermist, E.W. Darby, was the official provincial taxidermist. We actually did have one of those. And he was instrumental in restarting the Natural History Society of Manitoba, which is now Nature Manitoba. And here's one of his specimens that we have that he created in the 1920s. This is the bottom of it, showing it's E.W. Darby, Western Grebe. This is a different taxidermist from a little earlier period, from 1905. This is Ashley Hein. He also became a very famous taxidermist, went down to the Field Museum in Chicago, and many of the birds that you'll find in their exhibits were put up by Ashley Hein. So these are specimens we still have in the collection, and they're still educating people after all these years. So here they are in the brand new Prairies Gallery. This is actually the Whitewater Lake exhibit. You can see the Western Grebe here and the Horn Grebe down here. So even after well over 100 years, they're still doing a job. Taxidermists also did a lot of weird things. People didn't have televisions or radios, so they had parlor cases. These were usually birds that they had collected themselves. A lot of people were hunters in those days. And they would bring them to the taxidermist. He would make up these fantastic menageries. There's about 20 species of birds in this particular parlor case. They would put them in their living room as conversation pieces. And over the years, of course, these get put in people's attics. They're no longer in style. And so they were many of these were offered to us in the 1970s. And there's some very valuable specimens in some of these cases. One of our passenger pigeons comes out of such a parlor case. Of course, there were professional collectors. This is one of them. An excellent ornithologist, was in Manitoba for a relatively short period because he died quite early. This is Cyril Harold, and he was hired by many museums, not the Manitoba Museum, but by the Canadian Museum of Nature, for instance, to go out and collect birds for them to add to their collections. He also had his own personal collection, and that's what we have at the Manitoba Museum. When he passed away early, his family donated those specimens to the Manitoba Museum. So we have almost 1,000 specimens that he collected. This is one of them here. This is a purple sandpiper that was actually collected in Winnipeg. So a very unusual bird for this area. And he was an excellent collector, worked with some very famous ornithologists. This is William Rowan, who was a professor at the University of Alberta, pioneer in migration studies. Some of the workers at the Manitoba Museum, the first Manitoba Museum, like Bert Cartwright and Terry Short, who later became a very famous artist with the Royal Ontario Museum, and local naturalists like Harris, did some collecting locally. This is a nest of a Barred sparrow with the eggs up here, for a study they did on Barred sparrows that were nesting just north of Deer Lodge, which is a suburb of Winnipeg. And so we still have this collection, and it's a very important record of this species breeding in this area. Here's another one, Stony Mountain, collected by J. Dewey Soper. Also worked for the museum for a little bit, and then became a very famous researcher and explorer in northern Canada. But this is from Stony Mountain, another good record. Amateur naturalists, like the Crittles, for instance, very famous pioneer naturalists of Manitoba, have also donated specimens. They're a big supporter of the early Manitoba Museum. So they gave us not only birds, but some mammals. This bird here is actually an interesting one. It's a hybrid between a sharp-tailed grouse and a greater prairie chicken. And then other amateur naturalists, especially as kids, was very popular to collect eggs. So a lot of people through the 20s and 30s had egg collections as kids or even adults into adulthood. It wasn't illegal then, so they went out and made these. And later on, when they get up in years, they have these in their attic. They're wondering what to do with them. They call us and they donate those for us to add to the collection. Some of these are well curated with numbered eggs and the species, and they're very valuable because we, of course, can't go back in time and get these eggs again. So these are 100-year-old eggs that we can add to the collection many, many, many years later. Of course, the collection is still growing with modern birds that we get even today. Today, I was just offered a varied thrush that someone found that's going to be coming to the collection. Of course, we mentioned window kills before, and indeed, a lot of the birds that we get donated to the museum come from window kills. People have birds hit their windows. They call us, ask about them. We tell them to put them in a bag with some data, when they found it, where they found it, freeze it for us, and then they can bring it down and we add them to the collection. So here's a Cape May warbler that someone brought in. This is a Eurasian collared dove. This is the only specimen of this species for Manitoba. They're getting more and more common. This one froze one particularly harsh winter in someone's backyard, and they let me know, and so we've added that to the collection. And of course, we have partnerships with the Manitoba government through Fish and Wildlife, Environment Canada, through the Assiniboine Zoo, the University of Manitoba. And so we get birds from those sources as well. So these are usually window kills or road kills, accidental takes from other projects, for instance, wind farms, those sorts of things. So these are found birds, but they're not wasted. They're added to the collection for research purposes. So how do we make a study skin? Well, here's that same Cape May warbler sitting on the lab bench in my office. The tools are out. We're ready to dissect it. We have some vials out here. The first thing we do is weigh it, measure it, make several different measurements, look for ectoparasites. These are things like feather lice and the like, and put them in these vials and send them off to other researchers. And we just look at the general condition of the bird. And I won't go into too many details given it's just shortly after dinner, but when we dissect the bird, we usually make an incision along the belly here, and we remove pretty much all of the skeleton and all of the internal organs, except for a few bones in the wings, the feet, of course, part of the skull and the bill, and then replace that with a ball of cotton, make a good body form here and shape it, put it in a low temperature oven, dry it out, and then voila, we have a study skin at the end that we can tie a tag to that has all the data associated with it, where it was found, who found it, various measurements. And probably as important, we also look at the internal organs so we can figure out whether it was in breeding condition, what sex it was, because frequently you can't tell the sex of birds until you dissect them. We can look at gut contents. We can see what they were eating. We look for internal parasites. So there's a lot of information that we can get from these preparations. This is kept with the specimen in our database and then is available for further research. So really what we have is is a natural history archive. We have archives of birds at the museum. So just as people keep paper archives to record the history and the goings on of human activities, we have the physical specimens that can tell us about what was going on to the birds and their environment over the decades. So what does this really mean for Manitoba's important bird areas? So we'll take a look at a couple of examples here. In the north, we'll check out the Churchill and vicinity. In the south, we'll look at Sandy Bay marshes. A little further south in the southwest, we'll just look at Whitewater Lake, and then Delta Marsh near Sandy Marsh again, just briefly. So if we look at Churchill, I'm going to take you sort of down a trip down memory lane. Sorry for the quality of the next few images, but these are from slides of mine that I've copied when I was at the Churchill Northern Studies Center in 1984. And this is sort of a Churchill Northern Studies Center was then at the Akudlik Marshes, just south of Churchill. Some of you may have actually been there at that time, I'm not sure. And here's a sort of a classic, the S&M supermarket that used to be in Churchill was sort of a landmark that's now disappeared. Don't worry, if you're going up to Churchill, the Churchill Northern Studies Center is a lot different today. It's a fantastic modern facility for research and for education. So if you're going up there, make sure to check it out. Now, the reason I'm taking you down this sort of memory lane, this is another one of my old slides, is because of the Ross's gulls that really put Churchill on the map as a birding and important bird area in a way. So here's a pair of Ross's gulls that were down there in 1984 when I was visiting. But they had already been nesting. The first nesting recorded for North America was near Churchill. And some of those nests didn't quite work out. Some of the eggs didn't hatch. Some of the nests failed. And we have that physical evidence in our collections. So here's a Ross's gull egg from 1982. These are chicks of Ross's gulls from 1982 and 1983, from unfortunate nests that didn't quite make it probably due to bad weather. And we also have other Churchill specimens in the collection that are unusual, like black guillemot and king eider. These were found dead on the road. So these are, again, physical vouchers, what we call vouchers of rare species in important bird areas. We have a few eggs from Churchill as well. These are Semipalmated Sandpiper eggs. These are Whimbrel eggs taken at the same scale. So you can see the difference in size. These are both collected in 1950. And these are sort of important because as things change in the north, now we have samples of these birds. Semipalmated sandpipers actually breed quite rarely in Manitoba now, so potentially someone could study these eggs and maybe find something out about what's going on up there. The Sandy Bay marshes I've never visited, but they look like a fantastic place. Maybe Amanda can tell us something about them at some point. The reason I know it's a fantastic place is because we have the Chagnon collection from the Sandy Bay area. He was a priest in that region, collected in the 1920s to the 1930s, and have some very rare specimens from that time period. For instance, Lewis's woodpecker on the left. There's just a couple of dozen records for the province of Lewis's woodpecker. The king rail here from 1921 is the only confirmed record for that species for the province. Common gallinule, I believe there's only a couple of records of that species for the province. And I stuck this one in sort of for fun. We don't actually have good data for this one, but it is part of the Chagnon collection. And this is a royal tern. So it's very likely that this royal tern was taken at Sandy Bay. Unfortunately, we can't determine that for certain, but if you're ever at the Sandy Bay marshes, maybe keep an eye out for some of these rare specimens. Whitewater Lake down here in the southwest, there are actually very strong collections from this area. Again, due to our friend Harold. He was hired by the Canadian Museum of Nature to collect at Whitewater Lake. So there's several hundred specimens over a couple of seasons that he collected. He also kept some of those specimens though in his personal collection. And we received those when they were donated to the Manitoba Museum. One of the most spectacular is the only confirmed record of cerulean warbler for the province, and he collected in 1924. There's also some other interesting records, things like screech owls from the area, and of course a lot of shorebirds, and I showed you those specimens previously. Just another sort of specialty of the Southwest, a couple of specimens, Lyleton. It's not from Whitewater Lake, of course, but it does fall in another important bird area. And then here's a Say's Phoebe from the Whitewater Lake that was donated to us by Colin Blythe. And some of you might know Colin. This specimen was in pretty bad shape. It had been chewed on by some, he found it in the wild there, and it had already been chewed on by some rodents, but we thought it was important enough to try to make a specimen, so we made this flat skin, and it makes it available for researchers in the future. Other examples of specimens from important bird areas that are unusual are Oak Lake and Whitewater specimens of burrowing owls. So perhaps if things go the right way in the future, we'll be able to look for these species in those important bird areas. And from Whitewater, I believe this is the last known nesting attempt of piping plover in Manitoba. This occurred just to the northwest corner of Whitewater Lake. Unfortunately, the nest flooded and someone retrieved what was left of the eggs, and we have those in the collection. And lastly, we'll just take a very quick look at Delta Marsh. Delta Marsh, very famous waterfowl study area. They also had captive breeding programs. The museum has many specimens from those captive breeding programs, and the ducklings were used to produce this spectacular book. It was published, I believe, in the 80s. But these are all paintings based on specimens, that many of those in the Manitoba Museum collection. If you like cute ducklings, this is definitely the book for you. Our specimens from some important bird areas are also used for scientific research. So here again is a specimen from our friend Harold. This is a greater prairie chicken. Here's a picture of some live prairie chickens on a lek. So if you've never seen these birds, I highly recommend that you go and try to go see them. It's really well, you'll never forget it if you get out to watch these. Unfortunately, they don't occur any longer in Manitoba. And the old explanation was that here, this darker color here was the original range. And then as colonists came through from 1880s and started farming, this made this habitat more attractive to greater prairie chickens, and they moved with the plow up into Canada. Unfortunately, farming practices started to change, and this was detrimental to greater prairie chickens, and they retracted their range again, basically back to this original range. So they no longer occur in Canada. So that's the classic explanation. This group of researchers decided to take some DNA samples from museum specimens, including those from the Manitoba Museum. So I cut little pieces of skin out of a few of our northern section. So they were just too different. So they had to have been there for far longer. So the idea for them was that these populations were always there and then disappeared once farming and colonists came in and reduced their populations. Here's another example using feathers. This is stable isotope analysis again. This group of researchers from Texas and Oklahoma wanted to look at some of their wintering birds and where they were coming from. So they were getting museum specimens, at least in part, from places like Delta Marsh. Here's a Nelson sparrow and a LeConte sparrow from Delta Marsh. And this is an old Chagnon yellow rail, Chagnon collection yellow rail, like from Sandy Bay area. I sent them parts of feathers that were pulled from these specimens. They analyzed them, and for at least a couple of species, yellow rail and Nelson sparrow, they were able to suggest that Western populations of those two species also winter in the west of the wintering range here along the Gulf Coast. So if you want to try to protect these species that may occur in some of these important bird areas, you also need to be looking at their winter range. And now we think we know where that is, using, at least in part, museum specimens. Of course, one of the most important uses for our specimens is environmental education. So we're able to use our specimens as illustrations for various environmental impact, and just to create an appreciation for the diversity that we have. So we're trying to create advocates for the environment. This is a brand new exhibit in the Prairie Gallery called Breaking the Land, which looks at changes that we've made to the prairies that have influenced the kinds of animals that can occur here, including birds. One of those things is draining wetlands. I thought this might be an interesting story for some of you because you probably bird in these areas. This is Broomkill down here and Carmen here. Some people like to drive around here and look for snowy owls in the wintertime. But all this area, this used to be a 200 square kilometer marsh called Great Hay Marsh, which was drained in the early 1900s into the Morris River. And so this large wetland that you can see in this map from the 1890s is very prominent, and now it's completely disappeared and is all farmland. So that exhibit also looks at I've sort of separated it into 4 sections: war on wildlife, which is about market hunting and pest control, following the plow, so animals that have come with humans and been introduced into the area, including crops for that matter. Ghosts of Manitoba, those that have disappeared, like the whooping crane, which once nested in the province, and those with uncertain futures, which definitely includes grassland birds. Many of you are probably familiar with this kind of rather sad graph where we know that populations of grassland birds, these are some of the most affected species in the province: Sprague's pipit, chestnut-collared longspur, and loggerhead shrike, are plummeting. And if things don't change, it's very likely that we'll lose them sometime mid-century, perhaps. So we're able to let people know about these sorts of things and give them a few ideas about how to help these populations and influence things. For instance, we know that birds like burrowing owls rely on well-managed rangeland. So for a lot of these birds, having cows on the land and having well-managed rangeland, it might be their last opportunity to survive here in Manitoba. So we have exhibits as well of some important bird areas. Delta Marsh is one of those that is featured. So we have you can see the diversity that we have at Delta Marsh. You can press some buttons and hear some birds, learn some of the animals that live there. And Whitewater Lake is now a brand new exhibit in our New Prairies Gallery. And it is quite a large exhibit and talks about all sorts of features, including wet and drought cycles over the last few centuries, as well as the last couple of decades. You can see the changes in lake levels over time, from completely dry to super high, and what effects that has on bird life and on humans for that matter. The background there is a mural, as you see here on the bottom. This is a painting that was taken from images that I actually took during IBA blitzes. So these are photographs on the top that I took with Turtle Mountain in the background there. And then the artist turned it into this gorgeous mural and populated it with many different species of birds. We also have the specimens, of course, too. So we have a case showing the diversity of birds, that at least a sampling of the diversity of birds that occurs in Whitewater Lake, Arctic visitors that use it as a stopover, the breeders, some of the shelter belt birds, as well as some of the upland grassland birds. We featured these swallows were actually collected from roadkills, unfortunately, from the thousands that gather at Whitewater Lake in the fall. Unfortunately, they land on the road, and then yahoos in their trucks come zooming along and kill quite a number of them. I salvage these and turn them into this exhibit, and let people know that we've got incredible numbers of swallows that gather there. And then we also talk about some of the life history of these birds too. So I hope that gives you a bit of an idea of what the museum collections are about, why we have them, how they can be used for research and to help conservation causes. and that they do have quite a strong tie and link to Manitoba's important bird areas. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Randy. That was great to see behind the scenes. I see we have, clapping. I thought that was maybe a raised hand. But yeah, if anybody has questions they would like to ask, you can type them into the chat, or you're welcome to unmute yourself as well to ask Randy. I thought I'd start it with one, and that being, I noticed that you had quite a few duplicate samples of different types of birds. So what are some of the advantages to having more than one individual of a species in the collection?
Well, it's very helpful to have statistical samples for birds, or for any organism for that matter. When you're doing, trying to work on science, having one of something gives you an idea that something interesting might happen, but you often need to have several examples to show a trend. And as I mentioned, some of these in a way are duplicates, but they may be from different places in the province. They may be collected at different times. And so that's why we have what look like duplicates. I guess in essence, no individual specimen can ever be duplicated because they're all unique. But by having many of them, we can look for trends. Just as another example, people have measured museum specimens to look at wing length of warblers, for instance. And, you know, they're able to compare between species because they can get a whole number of these and then find an average and figure out how different they are. And from some of those wing lengths, they can determine what their migration patterns might be. For instance, warblers that have longer wings tend to be over water migrants. So many of our warblers that are here go to the coast and then fly over the Atlantic Ocean for very long distances. Ones with shorter wings migrate usually overland.
Great. Yes, I assume that probably holds true for other things too, such as plumage patterns and stuff like that between different individuals. We have a question from Letty. Does the museum also have sound and video recordings of birds?
We do have some of those. They are not, they're not really under my purview though. They were under the audio collection. But there are excellent recordings that are held at some museums. We do not have a particular collection that covers that, but it can be very important to have other evidence of birds or of any species, to not just have the actual physical body of something, but to have, like I said, nests, for instance, or other parts of them. We do have, if you want to listen to birds, we do have a lot of recordings through the galleries, the new Prairies Gallery. You can sharpen some of your birding skills if you like, because we do have a lot of prairie species calling in the Prairie Gallery.
Okay, thanks. Next we have Jack. He says, great talk, Randy. How much online access is there to the museum natural history collections?
Our museum, unfortunately, does not have particularly good online access, although you can access some of our collections through other sites. But we don't have our own site, but you can certainly contact any of the curators for any of the collections you're interested in, and we can provide a list of what we have or help you determine what we do have in our collections. We're in the midst of changing our database system, we hope. And after that happens, we will definitely have online access. That's a very important component to allow people to use the collections and know what we have. Now, these aren't the museum's collections. These are actually, we hold these in trust for Manitobans. So they should have as much access as they possibly can to the information that is held in them.
Okay, next we have Bill asking, do you analyze the shells, or so the egg shells, to determine environmental impact? Or I guess, is that something you have done?
I haven't done that myself, but it is certainly something that is done. Offhand, I don't know if it's been done on eggs that we have at the museum. We don't have a huge egg collection. That's another reason to have duplicates. So-called duplicates is that you can, you're more likely to be willing to permit what is sometimes called destructive sampling. So some of the like feather removal and those sorts of things, and using parts of eggs for chemical analysis. If you only have one of something, you're not as likely to permit sampling along those lines. So, but as I don't know of studies that have been done on our museum's eggs, but it certainly has happened at many other institutions.
Okay, thank you. Next from John, we have, are there any species that you're not interested in receiving, whether that's because you already have a lot of them or for any other reason?
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. I often get asked, you know, what's your want list, sort of. And it is true that, you know, we don't want every, unfortunately, you know, sapsuckers are particularly bad at hitting windows. And so are juncos, perhaps because they're just very common. You get a lot of those offered to the museum. And clearly we don't have the personnel nor the space to process every one of those specimens. It also depends where you live. So if you're in Winnipeg, we may not be as interested in getting every dark-eyed junco that happens to hit a window. But if you're, you know, live in a place that we don't have very good representation from the province, we may be very interested in getting even what are considered common species. So what would be best if you are thinking of, and that would be great, if you're thinking of keeping specimens for us, is to send, you know, is to keep whatever you find, and then just email me or call me, and we can figure out what best to do with those. I do have a slide, I guess I could share that gives my contact information, but we can, I don't know if that was on the poster or not. Anyway, we can do that at the end if we want. And for any of you that are thinking of potentially keeping birds for me, just quickly, it's very important that you don't handle these birds with your bare hands. So if you pick them up, make sure you either wear gloves or use a bag and turn it inside out and sort of use it as a glove to pick up the bird. Take the bird, squeeze as much air out of the bag as possible to reduce freezer burn. Probably double bag the bird at least if you're going to put it in your own personal freezer. And make sure that you put in data tags that tells when you picked it up, where you picked it up. The more information we have, the more valuable the specimen. But if you do that, like I said, make sure you get in touch with us. Probably be me. Us, it's me really. And I'll be able to tell you, you know, which we're probably interested in. but I can't necessarily tell you that until I know where they're from and maybe even what time of year that you've picked it up.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Randy. Yeah, if you want to put that slide up at the end so people know how to get a hold of you, that would be great. It looks like we have one last question here from Fiona. She says, do you have a good selection of ordinary birds, or does your collection have mostly unusual birds?
No, we have so-called ordinary birds. Common birds are incredibly valuable in for the same reasons that we were mentioning before. So if you can only have one of something, it's very important to have a voucher or a record of some of the rare birds, like the cerulean warbler that I showed earlier from Whitewater Lake. We would never know for sure that that bird had ever occurred in Manitoba otherwise. But we only have that one cerulean warbler, so we can't really learn that much about the biology of that animal, except it came here accidentally. The common birds that we have many more of in the collection, things like dark-eyed juncos or white-throated sparrows, even things like merlins, we have pretty good numbers of in the collection. Those become valuable because we can learn so much more about their biology from the collection. Like I said, you have statistical sampling. You can, you're not afraid to take feather samples to learn maybe something about their environment. You have other information. When we prepare them, as I mentioned, you have gut contents and parasites and all sorts of stuff. So yes, we do have a lot of so-called ordinary birds as well, and they can often be more valuable to learn about our environment and what's happening and what changes are actually happening through climate change and human activities than the rare birds that we have in the collection.
Thank you. Yeah, I think your the specimen you have of the Baird sparrow that was found in Deer Lodge, that's back when it was collected. That's an excellent example. We definitely wouldn't be finding Baird sparrow in that habitat or really near Winnipeg anymore.
Right, and even burrowing owls, we have burrowing owl specimens from Winnipeg as well, just outside of the airport. So these are things that for us now, it's normal to not have these birds anywhere near Winnipeg, but 100 years ago, it was not unusual, at least for things like Baird sparrows. Burrowing owls are a bit of an oddball that way, but yeah, having some of these old collections and samples of them does provide physical evidence that these birds occurred in places that we wouldn't expect them now because of the changes that we've made.
Well, thank you very much, Randy. It looks like we've finished with our questions and we've just hit 8 o'clock. But yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for joining us. Thank you everybody on the call for joining us today. And we have another webinar again next week. We're looking at the rise and fall of Delta Marsh with Dr. Goldsborough from the University of Manitoba. Same time, same day next week at 7 p.m. that we still have space available for if you're not signed up. So yeah, once again, thanks for everyone joining us. Thank you, Randy. And
well, thank you for having me, and thanks to everyone who joined this evening.